Alrighty, I think we're gonna get started for the second panel. Who the heck is? I'm gonna find it. Sorry, bear with me. Just pulling up a bio on my phone. Alrighty, perfect. Thanks very much. Hopefully everyone really enjoyed that first panel this morning. Some really rich discussion, and also I just love the dynamic on the panel. So I'm really excited again for what will be a fantastic second panel here. I'll let our moderator do the introductions for the panelists, but I'll just briefly introduce him. We're really lucky to have Dr. Scott McKnight here with us today. Scott McKnight is currently a research associate and lecturer at U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. His research examines the political economy of innovation and energy with a particular focus on China. His doctoral work focused on the comparative political economy of oil. McKnight holds a PhD from the U of T and a master's degree in international relations from China's Renmin University, where he also worked as a lecturer. And he's fluent in Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. And he's also my research supervisor. So a little thank you for that, for the late night revisions of my essays. So anyway, I'll invite Scott up now. Thanks very much, Scott.
How you guys? 还行吧，谢谢，欢迎你们呢。Welcome everybody. Thank you, Giancarlo. It's a spectacular the student there of mine. An absolute honor to supervise his work. It's an honor to be the moderator of this panel as well, by the way. Let's get into it. We have three very distinguished speakers who are going to be able to talk very in-depth, eloquently, and very expertly on several topics relating to global energy. And I think that's why we're all here for this afternoon stuff. We're going to go in order here. Peter Fraser, Diego Rivera, and Gary Marr. Let's start with Peter Fraser. Peter was the head of the Gas, Coal, Power Markets Division at the International Energy Agency for the period from 2016 to 2022. There he was responsible for these fuels. Gas, coal, power. He can speak about any of those topics very, very in depth. This was his second tour of duty at the IEA. He was senior electricity policy advisor from there from 1998 to 2004. He was also at the Ontario Energy Board, the energy regulator for Ontario, serving as vice president. Consumer and industry performance. And then going back further from 1989 to 98, he was an energy policy advisor at the Ontario Ministry of Energy. Peter holds master's degrees in physics from Queen's University and environmental studies from York, and a BSc in physics from the University of Toronto. So he knows what he's talking about. Let's really get into that. So that's Peter Fraser. He'll lead us off. Then we'll go to Diego Rivera. Diego, actually, in fact, maybe we let him start here, and then I can do the intros for the rest. Thank you, Peter. Thanks. Can we welcome Peter? Thank you.
Thanks, Scott, for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. We've certainly had a really good first session. Heard a lot to be optimistic about. Whether it's about G, as Phil was talking about, or reconciliation, or even, as we heard, some positive developments on the policy side. I want to kick off this session talking about, from more of a global perspective, about what's going on. And certainly, if you just think about this week, there's been a lot happening geopolitically, which is going to affect the geopolitics of energy. On Monday this week, we had the IPCC release its report, showing first that emissions are continuing to increase, and despite the best policy efforts to date, not decreasing the way the IPCC says we need to do to get down to net zero by 2050. On Tuesday and Wednesday, Premier Xi visited President Putin. This has very significant geopolitical consequences and consequences for the energy system that I'll talk a little bit about. And then today, we've had President Biden visiting Prime Minister Trudeau. And it's not just caused a disruption to this event by causing one of our speakers to miss their flight, but also is very relevant, I think, to the future, especially when we talk about green industrial policy. Now, I like very much the choice of the title and the questions for this session. And the first question really struck me when I read it over, which asks, what role does Canada have in supporting the energy needs of our allies? And I thought the choice of the word allies was a very interesting one. It wasn't too long ago that when we talk about being an exporter, we talked about customers. And those customers could be companies or countries, and they could be friendly or less friendly, but it was something we wanted to sell them something, and whether they would want to buy it. But I think the choice is nevertheless quite appropriate, because I do think we're starting to transition into what I would call a post-globalist energy world. We at least believed, from a world where we at least believed that we were all working together to solve a common problem, to a world where we're going to break up into more and more regional interests. And certainly the place I would start to talk about this is very much in what I would call the grand bargain that's inherent in the Paris Agreement. It really was an attempt, an industrial strategy, but a global green industrial strategy. The challenge in creating the Paris Agreement, challenge since the 1990s, was how to get China in particular, and developing countries more generally, into the accord. Everyone knew that's where the growth was going to be in energy demand, and in particular fossil fuel demand, as has proven to be the case. What got the table and to agree to take the decarbonization path was the understanding that by signing up for decarbonization, they, as the world's factory, would be able to build the technologies and supply us, the advanced economies, with the technologies that would allow us to decarbonize. So China, which produces over half of the world's steel, over half of the world's aluminum, over half of the world's cement, and 80% of the world's solar panels, was going to have a crucial role. And that was the deal that they were offered, and that's the deal they took in 2015. Now, in that context of this very global world, and this particular fuel I'm going to talk about, based on my recent professional experience, is really about natural gas. And natural gas has got a particularly important role. It's that it's a fuel that's really become a global fuel in the last decade or so. Gas, because it used to have to be transported by pipeline with few exceptions, was really a regional commodity. But thanks to the major investments over the last decade, has become a global commodity that's can be traded from region to region. And the creation of that global market, the main consumers of that extra natural gas have been in China and developing Asia. Same area is going to be the world's manufacturing hub. And so those customers of natural gas, over the last decade, we've seen quite a significant growth. So probably about 50% growth in liquefied natural gas over the last 8 years. China has become the top importer of natural gas. And developing Asia is where most of the rest of the growth has been. In fact, by 2021, China was importing more natural gas than the European Union was importing from Russia. And a lot of that liquefied natural gas that they were importing was coming from the United States or from Australia, two rather advanced economies. Well, of course, that was 2021 when I mentioned that they were importing more than the EU from Russia. The EU's not importing very much from Russia anymore. The invasion in 2022 resulted in a very large supply shock to the global natural gas industry. And in response to that supply shock, you have to say that the global natural gas market, which is really fairly new, actually worked quite well. as you expect when there's all of a sudden a loss of supply. Prices went up, and there was less consumption. Not just in Europe, of course, because they don't have the Russian gas anymore, but also in Asia. In fact, Asia cut its consumption as much as Europe did, because the high prices in Europe were transmitted to high prices in Asia. So as a result, though as the loss of supply in Europe had serious enough consequences for some of its industries, in Asia, the consequences were much more serious. In Pakistan, for example, they couldn't afford to buy the gas. That meant they had no power. They had power shortages, had economic, health, and other consequences to being short of power. And these kinds of changes have just underscored the importance of living in a globalized world and how the impacts in one region affect another. And it wasn't just the gas that moved from Asia to Europe. Even gas infrastructure has moved from Asia. Natural gas, when you want to import natural gas, you don't actually have to build something on land. You can use a ship, a floating unit. Half of the world's floating units, which were in Asia, set sail for Europe. So they got the gas and they got the infrastructure. And those changes have, of course, had very significant impacts in way we think about energy, the important global issues about energy. Whereas before, perhaps, decarbonization was the sole issue for many countries. Now we think about energy security and we think about affordability as well. But what we think about those things probably depends a lot on where we are. So just think about where the two big fossil fueling regions in the world, Europe and Asia. They think about it rather differently as a consequence of this invasion. In Europe, what the invasion has meant is that it's a really good idea to get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. They already thought that was the direction they want to head, but this has certainly given them a lot of real impetus to actually deal with some of the hard issues that you deal with if you want to decarbonize. And Europe is really a very good example of having now being forced to deal with those issues rather quickly, to actually site new wind farms, for example, which is a huge problem there onshore, to actually accelerate investment in new technologies like hydrogen. And those hard issues are now finally being addressed in Europe. But in China, and in developing Asia, they had a rather different lesson that they took from this. And the first lesson they took was that when resources are short, the rich get the resources. Energy security means rather different when you can't afford to buy it when you're in an international market. And when you take that lesson, so you want to buy a lot more cheap renewables, but more generally, you want to rely on domestic resources and import fewer fuels. So if you're China or India or Indonesia, that means you're also going to rely on your coal resources because you've got them. You don't have to rely on imports. And that becomes something that you're very reluctant to be persuaded that you don't need anymore. Even here in Ontario, and we have Dwight Duncan, Brad Dogood here, we went off coal, but we went off coal when we were confident we could live without it. You can't expect people in a developing country to do anything less when it comes to decarbonizing their own economies. They have to be confident to manage without it, that their energy supplies will be secure. So I think in the future, that's a much tougher market for LNG, liquefied natural gas. In Europe, the issue is, how much longer are they going to use fossil fuels at all? And so it's very good that the German chancellor will come to Canada or to Qatar to talk liquefied natural gas. But at the same time, not many in the industry believe that European companies are going to be encouraged to sign the long-term deals that it will take for people to invest more in producing more liquefied natural gas. The issue in Asia is rather different. There are still prospects for growth, but obviously the enthusiasm is less. Liquefied natural gas was never primarily about decarbonization in developing Asia. It was about energy diversification, because it's somewhat more expensive. Even a few years ago, it was somewhat more expensive than the alternatives. It was about growth, just needing more sources of energy. And it was really about also being part of this global business. Well, we're buying gas from the Americans. We're buying gas from the Australians. So it's, again, very much part of this international energy cooperation issue that was the case in the past. But now they look at the situation, they see it's changed. They see the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. They've seen the proposal of the European Union to introduce onshore the production of solar panels, among many other green technologies. And they realize that maybe things aren't going to unfold the way that was promised, or at least implied, in the Paris Agreement. Maybe they won't have access to the markets that they thought that they would. So they're thinking about all this rather differently. And so the role of LNG there they'll be somewhat less enthusiastic than they were in the past. And that, to me, is really the biggest. There will be some opportunities in the gas market, don't get me wrong. For example, Japan currently gets some of its LNG from Russia, from Sakhalin. And they're worried that maybe in the next year or two, they won't be able to get it anymore. And so they're looking for alternatives, including from Canada. Similarly, there will be some growth in Asia, in Taiwan, for example. They want to get out of nuclear power. The government's been very determined to get out of nuclear power, and they definitely see LNG as part of the solution to get them out of nuclear. And there will still be the center of a lot of growth in the world will be developing Asia. And so there really are some markets there. There are still opportunities to grow. But it's clear that the enthusiasm or the optimism about that is not going to be as high, partly also because the prices for gas are expected to remain higher than they would have been a few years ago. But for me, the biggest consequence of this is really about the traveling of the grand bargain that I mentioned earlier. A bargain where we're no longer talking about global markets which have customers, but really about regional blocks where we have allies, where meetings between Xi and Putin or Biden, Trudeau, take on a new type of importance, but without the level of international cooperation that we might have hoped to have seen in the past. And all against a backdrop of the IPCC warning us about the increase in dangerous concentrations of greenhouse gases. So, with that, I thought I'd leave that maybe not quite as optimistic as our earlier speakers, but I think there's still a lot good going on, and I think we'll hear probably a little positive things from our next speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Great stuff. Friendly reminder to, if you have questions, comments, you can fill out your cards and we'll be accumulating those as we go. Perfect. We'll continue with the speakers. In the meantime, thank you, Peter. Let's hear from Diego Rivera Rivata. He'll speak authoritatively about also global energy markets, in particular Latin America. Diego currently is research associate at the Center of Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He is responsible for analyzing energy policy developments in Latin America, researching natural gas and LNG markets. His research interests also include studying the role of natural gas in the low-carbon energy transition across regions, especially in the developing world. He also can speak authoritatively about critical minerals and geopolitical implications of the energy transition. Prior to joining the Columbia Global Energy Policy School there, Diego was a visiting researcher at the Asia Pacific Energy Research Center that is based in Tokyo, and he was there for 5 years. Diego's got also a very extensive resume, very, very good stuff. Bachelor's degree in international relations from the ITAM in Mexico, master's in public policy with a specialization in energy from Sciences Po in Paris. He speaks Spanish, English, French, Russian, Portuguese, probably a bunch of other ones, but I'm running out of space here. So on that note, welcome, Diego.
Thank you very much, Scott, for that very generous introduction. And good morning to everybody. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you very much to the organizers, to the students for making this happening. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and I hope I can contribute to that. And we haven't spoken quite a lot other regions of the world, and that's a bit my attempt to try to start a bit global and then dig a little bit, probably not too much, in Latin America. I'll try to go quick, but certainly there are some points of coincidence in which I'm sure I can skip and then dig in the ones that are more interesting further in the discussion. Just a couple words about the Center on Global Energy Policy. It's a really 10-year anniversary coming up next month. It is an institution at Columbia University in New York City in which basically it's a group of people, from scholars, former members, policy decision makers, and members from industry previously that try to produce a set of well-worked, data-driven analysis to policymakers and kind of bridge academia and making. That's the main goal of it, and so that's what we do. So let's get started. This the previous one. Good. I'm not sure if. That's actually the previous one. Could you help me with? Yeah, there we go. So this has been mentioned already quite a bit, and I'll start global. This was on Monday, and this is basically the key message here is the pace and scale of climate action is insufficient to tackle climate change. In other words, we're not on track. And this is what the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is saying. And this funny graph, basically what means you see historical emissions coming up from 2010 till today, and what we need is basically to change directions quite drastically. Basically, to keep the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have a carbon budget that is like we can emit only so much, and that only so much is 500, that's a magic number, 500 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. But that is equivalent if we keep the pace that we've been consuming energy globally, this would be depleted by 2030. And so that means there's no way back for 1.5 degrees. As Peter and others mentioned before, it's a pretty sobering message in which it says if there's not a massive turn or transformation on the doing things, then really the 1.5 degrees Celsius is very far away. I've heard from some people, they are like, let's be realistic, let's assume that it's depressing and we're not gonna make it. There's debate on that, but the fact of the matter is like, that's what the science is saying. So that's to start on a pretty sobering note. For doing that, emissions must be halved by 2030, and investments on energy solutions, on all the things that we were speaking on, from renewable energy to new technologies that today are not commercial, the finance should be 3 to 6 times higher to what it is. And then another aspect that is important to mention, and also Peter mentioned a little bit already, this is a very interesting graph and basically shows like from the pre-time of the Industrial Revolution to today, how emissions have increased and where have been taken. One important fact to consider is that greenhouse gas emissions are cumulative. They stay in the world once they are. And so we can see that historically, and for many years, they have gone to the developed world, right? As we can see, Europe, the United States, but today, and this is, if we look to the statistics today and the past 5 years, really that has been coming from developing countries, particularly China, but also India and other developing areas. And so we can see that from the developing world, about 2/3 of global emissions come from there. but historically, not quite the case. And so, for instance, in per capita emissions, India produces 7% of global emissions. However, this is 60% less than the global average in per capita terms, and it is about 8 times lower than what your average American inhabitant consumes. So that is absolutely massive. If we can see, why would somebody, the US, would be able to consume 8 times the same level of energy than somebody in the developing world? That is reality, and that is part of it. And that creates discussion on energy access, poverty, and inequality. And this next slide, I think, clears that quite a lot. This is an image of the world at night. And basically, this is a proxy of access to energy. So you can see there are those bright spots you can see very clearly, in the US, in the big Canadian cities, around New York City, some other brilliant spots in Europe, increasingly in Northeast Asia, Japan, for instance, along Brazil. But we do see some black areas, or less bright ones, and that is because there's with obviously lesser population in some cases, but in other cases not. It's with quite a bit of population, but not enough access to energy. And so that really, look for instance, just around Indonesia, in Asia, just the sub-Indian continent, and of course Africa is a big one. So 750 million people lack access to electricity, and 2.5 billion people lack clean cooking solutions. That is things just like as natural gas when you turn your stove to cook your oatmeal in the morning or your coffee. And so this is a reality. And so we have a series of challenges and crises put all together, right? So we're in a climate crisis in which we have to turn the way we consume, produce and stuff, energy just to turn away emissions. We have to provide access to energy to all the regions. And then on top of that, we got the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic that have led to what several people have called the first multi-fuel energy crisis. Certainly the worst crisis we've seen since probably the end of the Second World War. And I think this graph on the top left, both of them are from the IE, where Peter used to work. But I think the first one is pretty telling, because it's just how prices have changed compared to January of 2020. And really what we can tell, there are a bunch of indicators for people that are not too familiar with the energy sector, is different prices for natural gas, for instance, that TTF stuff, that's the European price, German power, Asian spot, liquefied natural gas. And we can say that basically the one field that has been most disrupted is natural gas. As we can see, there's an absolute crazy, volatility and changes. And now, it's coming down, and then it goes up again. And we saw that in 2022. And part of that, obviously, is that Russia is a very big provider, very big supplier and exporter of fuel, right? And then we can see that on the second graph, which is in particular Russia's pipe exports. Sorry, the imports of Europe from pipeline through. Most of them coming from Russia. And what we can see is that the Russian imports are, first, they go quite down, and then we had all this saga of drama along with the Nord Stream pipe. We are pretty familiar with it. And so in this context, let me try to make a turn to what's going on in Latin America. And we can go to the next one. Yeah. So I want to stick to this topic, which is natural gas, and I'll try to do not go too deep into that. But the story of natural gas consumption in Latin America is that today it is a critical fuel for the energy sector in most of the world, but certainly in this region. And it is a story of mostly the power sector. Unlike places like Canada, for instance, where winter is not particularly mild, demand for heating is quite important, demand for cooking. Demand for industry is pretty big. In America, it's mostly a history of coupling with the power sector. There are certain, I was thinking as the first speaker was saying a number of things about Canada, including, for instance, that the grid is already kind of clean, right? In terms of 80% of power coming from non-fossil fuels. In Latin America, it's kind of similar. 70% of power comes from clean sources, from hydropower. And so that leaves an opportunity not only for other fuels, but also there's not a lot of coal, there's not nuclear. So really your one option there is natural gas. So that's really where it is very important to couple hydropower and other variable renewables. And this is mostly done in 3 countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. Demand has been increasing at a slow pace, but increasing. And then if we see on the production side, we'll see that actually there has been a decrease on it. So natural gas production, which has been in quite an important decrease, with the exception of 2 countries, Brazil and Argentina. Latin America holds about 5% of world's reserves of natural gas, and this has created a supply. So this means that as demand increases, you're producing less, you need to import that, and thus you become more dependent on these natural gas imports. And we can see that supply gap coming on that red bar, basically. So about 35% of natural gas consumed in Latin America comes from it. And then if we look at it from a country-to-country basis, we see in that color blue that is mostly, again, 2 countries, but mostly the blue one is Mexico. And the bulk of that are pipe imports coming from the US, and mostly from Texas. So basically, the majority of that line, the majority of that massive growth on imports is the story of Mexico, one of the world's largest oil producers, actually, of oil and gas, turning into a large importer of natural gas, particularly from the US, creating a series of security of supply concerns for Mexico. But also, as we can see in the next slide, these are LNG imports to Latin America, liquefied natural gas, so gas that is put into ships and then imported. And what we can see is an illustration of what happened with those crazy high prices during 2022. As you can see, just right after 2021, every single month compared to the previous one of last year, imports have decreased. Why? Because these are developing nations, they don't have the big money to get it, and these flows have gone to Europe. And this is the case of Latin America, but it is also the cases in South Asia, like Pakistan, very, very clearly, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Thailand, and this is a reality. These natural gas that otherwise would have ended up here ended up going to Europe. And as a matter of fact, other fuels need to be used, and some of them being more pollutant and more expensive, such as coal or residual fuel oil, right? So that's an important. And on the other hand, similar to Canada, I think, there's some advocates for saying like, well, most of these countries are, endowed with important resources of fossil fuels. We have a lot of natural gas, we have a lot of oil. That's the case of Brazil, that's the case of Argentina, which in these reserves are huge. That's the case of Mexico to an extent. But we can kind of there's this temptation of, look, we could save the world, we could save right now. And the story is way more complicated. That requires a bunch of investments, infrastructure development that takes years and that cannot be done immediately. And in fact, the 2 that were able, in theory, of doing it, Peru and Trinidad and Tobago, that are the 2 exporters of the region of LNG, are actually not doing a great job and were not able to capitalize that. As you can see, their exports pretty much remain at the same level. And that was due to technical problems and really depletion of their own resources. They are running out of natural gas. And then and this is a bit of the extreme, Mexico, that is a net importer, is the largest importer in Latin America. There's an appetite, or there's some projects, a bunch of projects, to re-export US-produced natural gas. This has been all over the media in Mexico, all over the place, and in policymakers. The government has support for some of these projects. And one of them, Ica LNG, on your top left, you can see that's moving on. And so that would be an based in Mexico that will actually re-export gas coming from natural gas to Asian markets. That is quite a thing, considering that there were a number of projects of similar capacities in Canada proposed, and only one has moved ahead, right? Like LNG Canada. So I just thought this could be interesting. I'm happy to discuss a little bit about this later on. And another that I just want to consider, moving a little bit away from natural gas, is just another that I think it's important for Canada as it is for Latin America, which is critical minerals, which are basically these clean energy technologies that we need require a new set of minerals. Some of them, not often labeled on the classic critical minerals, but that are pretty much essential, such as copper, for instance, which 40% of global production takes place in 2 countries of Latin America, Peru and Chile. And then for lithium, that's another particularly important. 3 countries are responsible for about 80% of production, 2 of them being in Latin America. And for reserves, about an important share of them takes place in Latin America, Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. So this means that for of these clean energy solutions that will take place, solar panels, wind turbines, batteries for electromobility, we will require more and more of these minerals. That can only be done through the support of mining activities that at its way also have implications for local communities, for the environment, that have impacts on other financing and needs, but we absolutely need these minerals, and that would recreate a number of geopolitical complexities because, as you can see on the right hand, most of the processing facilities of these minerals, once you take them out of the ground, are located in China. So there's a need for either partner with them or creating own supply chains, a little bit, creating this reforming of geopolitical challenges for the energy transitions. This could be a potential bottleneck, and I think Latin America in particular is particularly interesting for at least these 2 minerals, copper and lithium. And with that, I leave it for now. I'm happy to chat later. Looking forward for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diego. There, we got a lot of good stuff here. A nice global overview of a bunch of stuff. Let's go to now our 3rd speaker here, Gary Marr. Gary is the president and CEO of the West Foundation, Canadian West Foundation, that he has led for the last couple of years. He's very accomplished, very respected. You'll soon see why here. He brings deep experience in government, business. He's has established expertise in the key policy areas of that foundation: natural resources, trade, investment, human capital. He is an accomplished speaker, a respected leader. With experience in government, business. He's done everything, really. He served in the Alberta Legislative Assembly. He was official representative of the province of Alberta at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. He later represented Alberta in Asia as well, on various trade missions, all the like. And recently, in 2022, Gary was appointed a member and chair of the Council of Alberta Order of Excellence, and he was also awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Medal for public service. Gary, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate that. Dwight Duncan would know this. Mike Schreiner would know this. Of course, Brad Dogood would know this, that when you're an elected person, you give thousands of presentations. So collectively, the ministers and the MPPs and myself have given thousands of presentations over decades. And one of the things that happens is, of course, you get introduced, and sometimes people read your biography, and sometimes they're not so good about that. And when I was Minister of Education, I was a grade 3 student was charged with the responsibility of introducing me. So in front of all the students, the parents, the teachers, and her classmates, there's a giant banner in the school, and it's "Welcome, Honorable Gary G. Marr." And so she got up there in front of all these people, and she said, "We'd like to welcome the horrible Gary G. Marr." And so it was this experience that caused me to take a serious look at literacy in our schools. Look, I want to say thanks for inviting me here, and to be amongst a group of distinguished and knowledgeable people, both this morning's panel and the later morning panel. I really want to thank the students who organized this. We had an opportunity to have dinner last night, and it was. I come out here and I learn as much as I might convey, and so I want to thank Giancarlo and Sarah and Matt for all the work that they put in getting really amazing people to come out here. Now, I want to say this. I have changed my complete presentation from what I had planned this morning based on what I heard today. And look, I think Phil was a really great way to start off. And he talked about that. My takeaway from what Phil had to say was that we get to net zero by 2050. It's a combination of three things. It's technology, it's policy, and it's financing. And actually, from his perspective, and I agree, this is true, the technology part's actually relatively simple. But the policy part is not nearly as simple. And, one of the questions that came out this morning that, was, how does the culture of things so that the policy is easier? And, the reality is everybody wants a change except when it comes to them. So, Brad framed it by saying, everybody wants a change in electricity, but they don't want to pay for it. And so in a real way, for politicians or policymakers, this is really difficult because you conclude that the only person that really wants a change is a wet baby, okay? So that's for the starting point. And then in terms of the financing, I mean, it's easier said than done to say that developed countries that have these technologies should transfer the intellectual property and, in a world where you've got capital markets that seek returns on their intellectual property, it's difficult to see exactly how that works. So I agreed with a lot of what Phil said, but some of it is easier said than done. Fiona gave a great Indigenous perspective, and I'd say being a leader sometimes is about being unreasonable. Now, she frames it differently. She says, I'm open-minded, and I think that's good. But as I would observe, George Bernard Shaw once said that reasonable people will change themselves to suit their environments, but the unreasonable will change their environments to suit them. Therefore, all progress in the world can be ascribed to the efforts of the unreasonable. So I'd say to Fiona, I really liked her perspective on how you move forward on making change. And then, I want to change the question a little bit, how it was put in your materials. I want to say, so the question is, does Canada have a role in supplying energy to our allies? Let me say, first of all, we should be asking our allies, what do they think? And of course, Chancellor Scholz and Prime Minister Kishida have both come to Canada looking for LNG. And I would say there are other places in the world that are looking for our LNG as well, South Korea being one of them. In fact, the president of South Korea fairly recently accused Canada of trying to hoard its resources and protect them from being used in other parts of the world where they're needed. So let me slightly reframe the question this way. And the way I would reframe it is, should Canada play an important role in making the world a more peaceful and verdant place? And I think that the answer, Canadians, if you ask Canadians that question, they'd say, yeah, we want to help make the world safer, more secure. We want the world to be more environmentally sustainable, a more verdant place to live. And so I'm going to restrict myself to talking about, but there's really three big things that Canada can do to make us a more peaceful and verdant world. And it is energy, food, and fertilizer. And I'll just say two things about the last two. One is on food. There are only a handful of countries in the world that are food secure. That is to say, they produce more food than they consume. Canada is one of them. And, I would remind people that, the whole Arab Spring started over the price of onions in, a market in Tunisia. And so every country in the world is just a few missed meals away from the start of a revolution. And so can Canada do something about that? The answer is yes. Fertilizer is a piece that's related. And, I think Phil talked about the Haber Bosch creation of fertilizer that allows the world to not have only food available for 3.5 billion people on the planet, but 10 billion people on the planet. So fertilizer is critically important to ensuring that we have a more peaceful world. And I'll speak to this issue about technology, which Phil really touched upon. I'm old enough to remember back in the 1970s, there was a group called the Club of Rome that said, if the world reaches 4 billion people, like a Malthusian exercise, we're going to run out of food and there will be a collapse of humanity. Well, that didn't happen. Because of changes in agricultural technologies and fertilizer are certainly, at least in terms of calories, enough to feed people. You know, if there's 10 billion people on the planet, but the reason why we have starvation is because of political reasons, not because of an insufficiency of food. The distribution of it is not balanced. The second technology piece that I point out is, again, I'm old enough to remember in the 1970s, the 1980s, we talked about the thinning ozone layer. Sheep were going blind in the southern hemisphere because of too much exposure to ultraviolet light from the sun's rays. And that was true. But we figured out a way to use different things instead of fluorocarbons to aerosolize our spray cans, and refrigerants were changed so that now today the Earth's ozone layer is roughly the same, or it's actually started to repair itself from the crisis. And I would point out that Canada was really critical in the movement towards this and the Montreal Protocol, which took place in the 1980s. In the 1990s, we talked about acid rain. And acid rain was created because particulate matter that was coming out of smokestacks would deposit NOx and SOx on the land and on the water, and it would change the pH of water from 7 to 5. Fish couldn't grow in it. Crops wouldn't grow on acidified soil. Well, we figured out a way technology can put scrubbers on these smokestacks, and we don't have deposition of NOx and SOx any longer. Nobody talks about acid rain as the crisis that it was in the 1990s. So let me say, like politicians, I am optimistic. It's kind of like being a Maple Leafs fan. So I think that, Phil talks about the technology that's developing, but every politician has to have a certain amount of optimism, or you would never, ever run for elected office, is the reality. And so I don't think of, a glass as half full or half empty. I always think of it as that I'm halfway to my next glass. So in the transition to a net zero world, I would say this. There is a lot of good news, but there's also challenges. The growth of renewables has taken off in record amounts. But here's the challenge. Renewables are not displacing the use of oil and gas. What renewables are doing is they are adding onto the supply of energy, but the demand for energy continues to grow even faster. And so the consequence of that is that in order to get to net zero by 2050, we must find ways not only of increasing renewables, but also of figuring out how to decarbonize our use of hydrocarbons. And so, this is why I wanted to put a plug in for Phil's Carbon Management Canada. CMC is doing a remarkable amount of research on how you safely and permanently store carbon in the ground. So this facility that, that is operated by the organization that he's a chair of, it's got monitors all over it. If you ever get a chance to go visit this place, it is really amazing. I mean, this is the most monitored piece of land in the world, except for maybe the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. But it is an amazing facility, and the technology works. And at scale, it's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to do this. So I'm not the expert on the IEA that Peter is, but I look at their report from 2021. and they talk about, is it possible to get to net zero by 2050? The answer is yes, but it's hard. It's a really narrow thing, and a lot has to happen. So in 2021, they produced a report, and my takeaway from it is that there were 4 things that needed to happen. One is, starting in 2021, you could not invest in any new oil and gas, hydrocarbon projects. Number 2, the vehicles have to switch to all EVs by the year 2035. Number 3, all electricity has to be produced from non-emitting sources by 2040. And most importantly, number 4 is all the countries of the world have to do this, not just the rich ones. And so there was discussion earlier today, I think it might have been Brad, it might have been by Phil, about the Inflation Reduction Act. This is probably the most cleverly piece of legislation that has nothing to do with inflation reduction, okay? But it is providing what I would characterize the policy direction that you want to go, and it is like an unlimited, all-you-can-eat buffet of carrots. But in Canada, we don't have this unlimited buffet of carrots. We got like a baseball bat. So the policy levers that are being used in Canada are quite different than the ones that are being used in the United States. So what is actually happening with countries around the world who have made commitments to net zero by 2050? First of all, in the United States, their commitment is not to go to net zero 2050 for the entire economy. It's for government operations. So that is quite different in Canada. We're trying to get to net zero by 2050 for the entire economy. But in the U.S., it's for government operations. Notably, the biggest user of transportation fuel in the United States is the U.S. military. They're exempt from this. Okay, so that's for starters. In the United Kingdom, their 2022 energy plan, they're planning on 8 new nuclear reactors and expansion of North Sea drilling. In Germany, they're reopening coal mines and coal-fired power plants. In China, in 2022, 168 new coal power plants were approved. 160. So that's like building a coal plant like every 2 days. Okay, is what they've got. I've lived in Asia when I was responsible for the Alberta government's offices there. We had offices in Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo, Taipei, and Delhi, and that was the group of offices I was responsible for. In Beijing, if you take your dog for a walk, you have to take it as a matter of faith that the dog is at the end of the leash because you can't see him. The pollution in Beijing is horrific. Okay, so let's be clear on that. So and then the United States, President Biden has talked about cleaner energy and is putting his money where his mouth is. That's a good thing, but at the same time, he has recanted on his promise to renew leases on federal land, oil and gas. He has not done that. And in fact, he has just opened up a huge area called, I think it's called Willow in Alaska, for drilling of hydrocarbons, while at the same time saying, by 2035, we're not going to be needing any of this. And so there is a lot of differences between what people state their intentions are policy-wise and what they actually do. So who is on track to zero by 2050? It's really a number of small, relatively poor island nations, maybe half a dozen of them, that are on track to get to net zero by 2050. I think we have to be very cautious in looking at the United States in terms of what we do in Canada, because they are our biggest customer. Like 75% of our trade exports go to the United States. Their biggest customer. They are our biggest customer. It is a reciprocal arrangement. And it's important to note, though, that they're not just our biggest customer, they're also our biggest competitor. And so when we think about critical minerals as an example, this would be one of the discussion points today. when our two leaders, the Prime Minister and the President of the United States, meet. They'll talk about critical minerals. The United States, I mean, the way they're talking, they talk about, the Ring of Fire as if it's already their asset, right? They want exclusive access to our critical minerals. To me, if you want exclusive access, that means that you should be paying a premium on it. But because of our lack of trade infrastructure, things from here to other parts of the world, LNG, oil, and other things, the United States will come back to us and say, well, you only got one customer, and that's us, so we're going to pay you a discount instead. And this is maybe offensive to some people, but in a real way, our natural resources, we get paid a colonial price for things like oil and gas, where it's the consequence of the fact that 99% of our oil and gas goes to one marketplace, and that's the United States. Canada does have huge reserves of energy. We're the fourth largest producer of natural gas in the world. We are the third largest proven reserves of oil in the world. I would argue the largest proven oil of reserves in the world from a place that you can audit. So I think that's notable. But we're third after Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, hardly paragons of democracy. And we're ahead of the next three, which are Iran, Iraq, and the Russian Federation. So in my view, as long as the world is still going to yield, and it will for decades to come, it may go, the IEA projections that I've seen is that the current demand, it might go up to about 102 million barrels of oil a day. But by, sometime in the 2060s, it goes down to perhaps something in the range of more like 60 or 65 million barrels of oil a day. As long as the world is still using oil, Canadian oil should be the last barrel that comes out of the marketplace, not the first one. If you look at it from any measurement of ESG standards, environmental, social, and governance, Canadian oil scores high in that regard. And I would make the same argument of our natural gas. Now, natural gas is particularly interesting, and I've made some changes in what I'm going to say based on what Peter talked about. And the reality is that there are, as Peter says, still marketplaces and market opportunities for our LNG. And if you can displace the use of coal with LNG, you can dramatically reduce GHG emissions. This is how the United States has become really the country that is best in terms of reducing its GHG emissions, largely fuel switching from coal to natural gas. Now, as pointed out earlier today, about 82% of Canada's electricity production is already from non-GHG emitting sources, so we don't have that ability. But if we can move LNG to places in the world that use coal, this would be actually in my view, some have referred to as a hat trick. And the hat trick is that you're doing something that's important for the economic development of Canada. You're doing something that can help bring economic reconciliation for First Nations. And thirdly, you're doing something really important for reducing the overall GHG emissions in the one atmosphere that we all have. There's no such thing as a Canadian sphere. There's only a global one. So if you can reduce GHG emissions in another part of the world, under Article 6 of the Paris Accord, you should get credit for that under a mechanism called ITMOs. Now, I sometimes get caught up in trying to figure out what all the acronyms are, but it's internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So if we move natural gas to a place like Japan, and they use natural gas to produce their steel instead of using metallurgical coal, then we can get credit for that under our, again, another acronym, NDCs, nationally determined commitments, right? Is it commitments? Contributions. So the hat trick, in part, is natural gas. So the long and the short of it is, in my view, we do have a role to play to making the world a more peaceful and verdant place. Our energy is part of it. And I also would like to say I'm a big fan of conjunctions. What I recall being a kid was, there was a cartoon called Conjunction Junction. And anybody remember this? Yeah? So conjunction junction, what's your function? Hooking up words and phrases and clauses, okay? I really like the conjunction and, as opposed to the conjunction or. And I would say that can we develop energy responsibly in a way that is economically positive? The answer is yes. We can do this and that. We don't have to do this or that. Does it have to be fossil fuels or renewables? No, it's fossil fuels and renewables and small modular nuclear and geothermal and wind and solar. So it's all of the above. So I believe in a world that has energy abundance and not energy paucity. And as pointed out, energy is critical as one of the three areas of public policy that need to overlap more than ever. And that is economic development, energy, and the environment. You cannot develop any kind of energy, including renewables, without having some impact on the environment. You cannot develop any kind of economy without access to affordable, reliable energy. So these three policy spheres have to overlap. And that is our challenge as Canadians, is how do we do this and that and meet those three policy objectives together and move forward. So with that, I'll close. I'm certainly happy to take questions. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Gary, I wonder if I could just ask you a quick question. It relates to a combination of things. But at the start of your thing, I believe I've read that there's between 2 and 2.5 billion people in the world with no food security.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then should you not add a fourth thing to your summation to say that energy and the development of energy and the resources we've got in Canada is critical to meeting that food insufficiency of 2.5 billion people in this world today? Because that's a really critical political problem. If we don't solve that food insufficiency, then we've got a political problem, which is far greater about who's got a Mercedes or an Austin in the car.
Right.
This whole thing is really critical, and it comes down to some of the resources you were talking about.
I think you're right, and the sort of migration of people, that has come to places in the Mediterranean because of climate change and insufficient food. I mean, we're only getting a small taste of this with 40 people that came in through Roxham Road, last year in the province of Quebec. People who are migrants for all kinds of different reasons, but sufficiency of food is something that is a really critical issue. So I think your point is well taken. Yes.
I just think another one. I was going to add another one as well too, but it's also that provision of security, energy security to the rest of the world.
When I was in Washington working at the Canadian Embassy, I remember sort of an image of Hillary Clinton going to India and talking about how people were using dried dung to cook their food, and saying this is terrible for the health of the women largely who are food. But it did strike me as being interesting that she was more concerned about the fuel that was being used than the sufficiency of the lentils that were in the pot, right? So it is a bit of a rich person's perspective, a rich nation's perspective on what is really critical to meeting basic needs of humanity. But fuel security, maybe instead of saying there's three pieces of energy, food and fertilizer, maybe it should be 3 F's, and it should be fuel, food, and fertilizer that I refer to. But your point is very well taken.
Well, a lot of the dung now I think is being produced at Mar-a-Lago, isn't it?
Go ahead.
points being brought by Gary. How do we go from having this talk, lovely talk here, to actually getting the government to push through and get to net zero? Like, how do we actually get to that step? I mean, this is great discussion, but how do we get things moving, get the action going?
Vote.
Well, vote is part of it,
But he was saying, even when they say something like Biden, doesn't mean he actually will do it.
yeah. Let me go back, to answer your question, I'll go back to the 15th century. Salons in the 15th century were credited with being what caused the French Revolution. And a salonière, usually a woman, the person who would run the salon, and people would be gathered in rooms like this to talk about the changes that needed to be made. So I think of this as being a salon. You're a salonière. I guess that'd be okay with you. So anyways, the more that we can discuss like this, ultimately, if you're an elected person, you pick up the newspaper and you look topical today. If it concerns my constituents, I'm interested. Or as I used to say, whatever interests my boss, Ralph Klein, always fascinates the hell out of me. So whatever interests constituents have, but, so rooms like this, discussions like this, where you spend time with people that you don't necessarily agree with, but you listen intently, and you can be focused on solving a problem instead of just trying to win an argument. That's the way you get change, in my view.
I have a question here from the crowd, and this one will start with Peter, and the other two, of course, can jump in here. And we'll go to the home crowd here. We have an Ontario starting issue here, and an Ontario success story. Ontario kicking its coal habit in an 11-year period, completing off of coal, and this now bigger question of energy transitions and how they can be done. Are there any lessons that Ontario may have for the rest of the world, other regions, other countries, to decarbonize in this path? And you drive down the 401 further enough, you'll see this action. You'll see this in action with wind turbines and the like. What do you think, Peter?
Well, funny you should mention that. When I was at the IEA, I actually managed the production of a report about coal phase-outs, and I used Ontario as an example. And so there were a number of lessons from Ontario that I think were, because a number of countries have been considering coal phase-out, that I thought were transmissible and I think are also true in the broad transition. And I do think this security of supply issue, which, some might recall that the original election promise was to get rid of all the coal plants by 2007. And then it was 2010. And then 13. But it was always, there was the fine print, always, provided we could assure there was a reliable supply of energy. And so it ended up, in 2014, it was finally all done. We got it done, and that's what everyone remembers now. They took some stick for letting those dates slip. But the point is that I think everybody would agree that keeping the supply reliable was paramount. And I do think in the transition we have to be cognizant of is that we'll especially as the future very much in the IEA analysis, a lot of variable renewable energy because it's going to be very inexpensive compared to other forms. But then relying on this, we shouldn't be quick to toss out what we have that ensures the reliable supply, whether it's a coal plant or a gas plant or some other form where we think, well, we don't need that anymore. We've got batteries and wind and solar. What else do you want? So I think by keeping that as a high priority throughout the transition and making sure the government, this is really a government responsibility that, to keep that front of mind as you make the transition. I think you would have much more greater prospects of success in your energy transition.
Very good, thank you.
If I may, Scott, just following on that, is a Latin American country that is actually doing something similar, which is Chile. Actually, they announced about 3 years ago a retirement plan for coal-based fuels. And unlike Canada and unlike or like other developing countries, they are not precisely abundant in other sources. They don't have nuclear. They have some hydropower, but then you got like droughts, climate change effects, justly doing that. They got some renewables, but they did have coal. They have an increasing share of variable renewables, and even with that, they created this plan to phase out by 2040 originally, and they have been like going down on the line. And actually, private companies have had an incentive, much motivated for financing needs and built on this ESG philosophy and principles on kind of almost race against each other to move away from coal. And they have done so successfully. And now a new government, which is a bit more, let's say, progressive on the political spectrum, wants to stick to a date. And it's kind of happening precisely the same. It's like 2024, 2023, not really, 2026. And they are trying to keep a date. I think it's hard to keep a date because it has a lot of concerns. They have a lot of offsets, just technicality, the operation of the system, reliability of it, but also it has an impact on the environment, on the local community, first of all, that is like breathing every day, that particularly coming from coal, also on jobs, but also in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So I think the effort that Chile is doing is an interesting case study that builds on this experience. And more in a macro level, there are 3 partnerships that I think have captured, that are particularly important in developing countries that are very populous. I was talking about Vietnam. The first one was South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So just Indonesia has 280 million people, Vietnam around 100 million people, South Africa just below that. So these are major countries, developing countries that do not have access to financing. And this is called Joint Partnership, JTP, I can't remember exactly right now the name of it, but it's basically a partnership of international financing coming to this country to develop infrastructure in order to face coal and to not build new plants, as is the case of some of these countries, or as were the original plants, given the fact that their demand was expected to increase.
I'm just going to add one small piece. Has anybody ever been to Sault Ste. Marie? Okay, so all right. So I've been to Sault Ste. Marie. There's a plant there, the Tenaris steel plant. There's Algoma, there's Tenaris, and then there's a third one. But I went to go visit the Tenaris plant. They've gotten financing from the federal government to switch over from the use of metallurgical coal to produce steel to electric arc furnaces. So I think you need about 2,000 degrees temperature to process steel. It's really, really hot. You go there in the middle of the winter when you go into this plant. But that is an example where a proper investment by a provincial and a federal government combined is going to end up producing the greenest steel in the world, in my opinion. So as long as the electricity that's used for the electric arc furnace comes from a non-emitting source. And maybe the last point I'll make is, I don't think Fiona's still here, but in the summer of 1982, I lived in a tent in the high Arctic islands for about 4 months. So I have some sense of what it's like to live with energy paucity. And small modular reactors, and I'm talking about reactors that you can actually fit, in a sea container, is really part of the future of displacing the use of diesel to produce electricity in some of these small communities. And because the sea can is readily movable to different places, can provide a huge benefit to the quality of living and people that live in these communities, in smaller communities, but nuclear really being promoted. I think it's Aaron O'Toole's riding is going to have an SMR that's going to be built there, and it's going to use uranium from Saskatchewan. And on the subject of critical minerals, Saskatchewan, long before the Inflation Reduction Act, has already started down the road of having a critical minerals refining capacity in the province of Saskatchewan. So this is a very good trend line.
I asked a question on the earlier panel about federalism and electrical grids, and we may hear more from Dwight later about the hydroelectrics. But I want to throw a question out, because it's on your point. How do we get to these great policy goals in Canada in a federal, and more specifically, for example, my brother works in Calgary. He's just retired. He's worked in the energy industry for years. And when you use the word just transition from our federal government in Alberta, they think the transition is they're going to lose their jobs and nobody cares and nobody's going to do anything about it. So there's a vast, in that, in my part of the country, the West, when we have the laudatory goals of trying to deal with climate change and get to net zero. So I'd like to hear how this can be genuinely addressed when there are wrenching transitions for certain industries and great political fear, and they whipped up often by politicians who exploit fears, that
They would never do that,
no,
would they?
Well, you never do. I can name one or two who might. How do we deal with that political issue of fear on the kinds of massive changes that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I'd say this. In Canada, we often celebrate our diversity. The diversity of our natural resources, the diversity of our people, our cultures, the diversity of people and their ambitions in Nova Scotia are very different from what we see in the prairies, as an example. But we celebrate this diversity except when it comes to energy resources. And so, to me, the issue is not whether you use fossil fuels. The issue is emissions. And so if we can deal with emissions, then it should be okay to be using fossil fuels to producing energy. And the decarbonization, so when we talk about green technology, it means something different in different parts of but in Saskatchewan, in Alberta, green technologies or clean technologies means the decarbonization of industrial process and the use of fossil fuels in a way that can render emissions to zero. So a just transition is a frightening term for people in Canada, but if you frame the policy direction the right way and say we're actually focused on emissions, not on as one piece of it, that would be helpful.
Oh, did you want to go, Peter? For sure.
Just to contribute to the discussion, I do think the kinds of solutions that will work to get to net zero will really vary within Canada and globally by the geography. So for example, in Alberta, the coldest day of the year is when it's -30 at 6 in the evening and there's no wind. It's really windy in Alberta in the winter, but the coldest days, it's not windy. So how are you going to keep the lights on in a system like that? Especially when you think about it, 10% of, maybe less than 10% of the people use electricity for heating in Alberta today. But when you have a vision of a system where it's 100% of the people using electricity for heating, how is that going to work? So you really need to, when you try to figure out how that would work in Alberta and you do the kind of study that have been done at the global or national level for Alberta and try to say, this is how it could work in Alberta, I suspect you're going to find things like carbon capture and storage are going to play a much bigger role. And say that's the only way it can work in Alberta. And batteries don't work so well at -30. We're going to need different solutions. And there'll be a variety of solutions, not like we know all the answers to it yet. So I think once you do those kinds of things and realize that a diversity of solutions are going to be needed, then I think people are more open to doing different kinds of technologies. Right now, the technology are seen as rivalrous. Oh, if you're going to invest in carbon capture and storage, you're going to spend less on renewables, and we need to spend a huge amount more on renewables, which we do. But at this point, it's because we don't have all the answers. And the IEA analysis, for example, yeah, we need enormous amounts of additional renewables. We need enormous amounts of energy efficiency, which is something we, I think needs a little more emphasis. But even when you do all these other things, and hydrogen and things like that, you'll still find, the IEA analysis says, well, and the last 20% is carbon capture. So, so the way that plays out in Alberta will be different from Ontario. It'll be different from say, a subtropical climate where you've got sun every day and you don't have really cold weather. But I think you really need to understand that it will require different solutions, and you need support for those solutions so you can actually apply them to that part of the country.
30 below in Winnipeg is a good day.
Yes.
We have a question on critical minerals, and this one probably goes to Diego and Peter. And this question of, is the new boss same as the old boss? Are we basically now replacing our dependence on oil and gas and all of those geopolitical challenges that go with that? 2022 was a hard lesson, especially for natural gas and oil, actually. Is critical minerals just going to be basically the same, but from maybe a new set of countries that are supplying them? Is the energy transition actually going to fundamentally form interstate relations and possibly even bring that peace dividend we're hoping for? Or, hey, we're still stuck in the same system, zero sum, and the same dependencies. What do you guys think?
I'll start with that, if I may. I'd say, to start short, no. I don't think that's going to be the case. That's not going to be a substitution. However, there's going to be a rethinking necessary of some geographies, some jurisdictions that have historically not been that relevant. So for instance, 80% of reserves and production of cobalt is located in the Democratic Republic in Congo. If you look at any development index in the world, choose one, it's probably on the top one from bottom to top. So it's the worst qualified in everything governance. So suddenly it's becoming important, and it's been slowly fought between China and the US and the powers. So we're taking all the attention to these other places, and I think that would be the case for other minerals and other regions. So we will see that geopolitical reorder that, and if that is not happen, and if that is not done well enough, then we could probably see some bottlenecks and more volatility and more, more of that. And if I may, I think with oil and gas, I think we are also probably going to see more volatility of that, as I do think, and just I want to keep it on critical minerals for Peter, but I do think that on oil and gas will decrease a long time, and that will create for producers and for some geographies, including, by the way, some of the Latin American ones, but also others in Southeast Asia, negative consequences for the economics of some certain regions, for some governments, and there would be a necessarily rethink, I think, of the economic activities they are doing. And so as supply and demand will unmatch at some point, I do think there's going to be ahead the road if this is not done well, both in oil and gas and also in critical mineral sector.
Yeah, a couple of points here. One of the big differences with a dependence on critical minerals is that it's much more of a stock rather than a flow question. That is, once you got the critical minerals imported into your country, you don't need a constant supply of them the way you do with gas. So that's a big difference. That's a big difference, so it does affect your security in a rather different way. And second, of course, there'll be different geographies where it's, when people were making a fuss about a year ago about the shortage of cobalt, I recall that there's a town in Ontario called Cobalt, so I have a feeling that we might be able to find some of that here. Generally there are a lot of countries who are playing a relatively minor role, say in the fossil fuel industry, who will have new roles here, and it's a good diversity, and some of them are places like Canada or Australia or Russia for that matter, where you can find these fuels as well as in Africa. Or these minerals rather, as well as in Africa. So I do think there will be a big reshuffle, but I actually think from a security point of view it will actually be better off.
Thank you. I want to thank Massey College for hosting the event. Giancarlo, Sarah, Matt, I'm sure several other people that I'm forgetting, for really organizing this. Thank you all for showing up. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you for our panelists, of course, too.
Awesome. Yeah, and thank you, Scott, for coming here all the way from Windsor as well. Appreciate you coming up. We're going to take another break. So in the other room, we'll have sandwiches. So we'll have like a little bit of a lunch for you. After that, we'll come back. And Dwight Duncan will be giving our final keynote of the day. So we'll let you know when that's happening. But feel free to stretch your legs and grab a bite in the meantime. Thank you.
Great. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Thank you. Thanks.
Great.